Welcome to the UK Finance webinar channel. My name's Eric Leenders, the Managing Director for Personal Finance at UK Finance. In today's session, in association with PA Consulting, we discuss seizing the opportunity of new consumer duty regulation. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Caroline Wayman of PA Consulting. Just before we begin the discussion today, I will cover off a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar will last for an hour, be available to watch on demand. You can access the recording by visiting UK Finance Webinar Library or via the event registration link. At the bottom of the media window, you can control your volume and view full screen. If you're having any technical issues, please click on the Test Your Connection button or use the Q&A to contact our support team at UK Finance. Any additional documents associated with the webinar will be found under the Resource tab. There's also a link to our feedback library, and we greatly value any thoughts you have on the webinar today, provided, of course, they're positive. Perhaps the more critical ones you might keep to yourself. Who knows? Do please post any questions you have via the Ask a Question tab. When you ask a question, your name is not disclosed to other webinar attendees. We will try to answer these during the webinar, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, we encourage you to reach out to our speakers or the team at UK Finance directly for an answer offline. Just to confirm, we have no plans for a fire drill at this end today, so if you do hear a fire alarm, I would suggest you don't run out of your home or office to a safe environment. So thanks everyone, and we'll begin our discussion today. But before we get into the Q&As with Caroline, I think you've got a few slides prepared, really as a kind of context scene setter, and perhaps it's best if I pass straight to you.
Great, thanks Eric, and yeah, great to be here discussing this important topic. So yeah, I thought I'd start by just giving a few kind of overview headlines and points that hopefully help sort of stimulate the questions we might receive and just set the context. I think that first slide just tells you who I am. Now partner at PA Consulting, formerly the Chief Executive at the Financial Ombudsmen Services for around 7 years, but a number of years grappling with interesting conduct issues at the Ombudsman Service. So yeah, this is obviously a topic that's close to my heart, and so can bring obviously that insight to the discussion. If we can move on to the next slide, that just gives you a little bit of an idea of what hopefully to expect and what we hope to achieve by the end of the session. And we're going to talk quite a bit, I think, about the culture shift that this entails, and I think that really is at the heart of the duty. Some of the key challenges, particular focus on the October deadline, which hopefully a lot of you are already familiar with, but we can cover that as well. And given my background, obviously happy to talk about how the Financial Ombudsman will approach interpretation of the duty, and we'll get into that in the Q&A in just a moment. But if we can move on to the next slide, please, colleagues. This just gives you a little bit of an overview, and hopefully for most people, these are sort of now becoming fairly familiar concepts, but I just wanted to say a few words, I suppose, about how these things all fit together. So, and really just to emphasize a few points. So I think, firstly to say there's an overarching consumer principle, and we'll probably get into this a bit more in the Q&A too, but I think really important to recognise that this sort of sits atop the whole framework and is standalone. And I think very important to remember that although the bits below colour in a lot of the detail about what it might mean, that is not exhaustive. By definition, this is a principle-based regime, and so it will be important to think about how you ensure overall compliance with this overarching principle. And I think it's quite well set out in what the FCA have published in terms of the interrelationship with principles 6 and 7. But I mean, clearly it will not be okay to not comply with 6 and 7 even where technically they're not the applicable rule, because I would suggest that you have to do at least as much as they require. And again, we might want to kind of discuss that, Eric, in a moment and get into this in a bit more detail. I mean, I think monitoring of good outcomes is going to be really important. So below the overall principle, the consumer principle, you have the cross-cutting rules. And again, I'm not going to kind of walk through what those are, because I'm sure many or all of you have kind of read those. But I think, really important to think about how you evidence those and how you monitor good outcomes. And we'll come back again in a moment. I just underlined this point about proactivity as well. So I mean, I think to me, one of the big changes here is the need for proactive action. So it definitely won't be okay to just patch the harm when it occurs and for that to be your only response. So thinking about ways in which you can have insights that are predictive in their nature alongside the metrics that you already have, I think will be important. And then I guess one of the final things I draw out, I think, is just the importance of understanding your customers, having a clear view around target markets and thinking about who those customers are, making the interventions that you need to when you identify potential harms. And again, checking of the understanding will be really crucial in that. And I think, checking customer understanding, to be clear that, getting them to tick a box will not be enough for that. So I think objectively being satisfied that they've understood will be important. So those are just a few overarching points, I think, on that slide I wanted to draw out. If we can move on, just to give a little bit of an overview on some of the things that moved a bit in the sort of final publication of the rules. I mean, this slide, which hopefully you can all see, and I'm not going to read it out. I think it just brings together some of the key concepts. So I know there's been a lot of discussion about the boundary for SME customers and trying to get greater clarity around that. I mean, I think that the FCA has stuck with the handbook boundary, and so that does require a bit of kind of mapping that through. But actually, I think it's probably less complex than creating a different boundary. So, but important to make sure that you draw that appropriately. I mean, I think a lot of discussion has been had around the risk of retrospection, and again, I think the FCA has tried to answer that point. No doubt, something we might get into in the discussion. But I think the FCA is clear, the Ombudsman is clear that. In deciding, and particularly from an ombudsman point of view, I would say, it will be about deciding what's fair, taking account of the relevant rules at the time of the act or omission, to put it in the language of DISP. So hopefully that gives some reassurance, but I think, it is an important point, and I understand the anxiety, but I would really underline that the Ombudsman is very clear that is the requirement, is to decide what's fair based on the prevailing law, regulatory rules, good practice, etc. at the time that the problem occurred. Implementation period, I think, is something we'll discuss in the sort of Q&A in a moment. So I don't want to say sort of too much about that, but I expect people have probably identified sort of the key dates which are on the slide there. So there's sort of slightly further out deadline in relation to closed books, obviously the main implementation date being next July, but I think really important to underline this 31st of October deadline. So be really important to make sure that you've got your plans in place, being able to get your board in the right position in relation to those and the assurance needed by that date. So I think that's quite an important milestone. And related to that, I think the other area that the FCA gave a bit more detail and expectations around was the kind of roles of the board in relation to oversight of the duty. And I think I can't underline enough the importance of that tone from the top. So obviously there's an overt requirement around the board's champion, But I think, really important to evidence that is something that's being led by the senior leadership from a management perspective, and that the board has sufficient and appropriate oversight of, albeit recognising its respective functions of the board and management. I think the final thing is just on the sort of supervision and monitoring, and I think it's going to be important to emphasise that this is not going to be July and done. I think there's going to be obviously a period of time building up to implementation where the FCA will be engaging more and more, I think, to understand people's plans and to be able to get comfortable that plans are in place and that people do have realistic plans to deliver the duty. But to my mind, this is not going to be, we get to July and then declare victory. I think this will be an ongoing process, and I think probably for most firms will reach a degree of sort of maturity with duty by July, but then it will be an ongoing process of getting to best practice and improvements, particularly I suspect in relation to data and monitoring. So just final slide, if we can just move on to that, and really sort of keen to get into the Q&A really. So I think the final thing was really just to sort of draw out some of the key challenges which this slide seeks to do in terms of thinking about what you will want to make sure you're addressing your minds to. So I think for most firms, you'll be asking questions around the sort of capability that you have within your organisations and the extent to which you need to build any new capabilities. And I think I would emphasise that there's sort of the sense of proportionality is something that the FCA has repeatedly emphasised. I think both in kind of speeches, discussions, but also in the guidance, it's in the final policy statement itself. But it is important, I think, to ask yourself those questions and think about future capabilities. I mean, for example, I think there's quite a strong emphasis in relation to thinking about behavioural biases, and so that's an example of something where you may or may not already feel that you have access to or the sorts of capabilities you need within your organisations. I'm sure we'll talk about this some more in a moment, but thinking about what is a good outcome, trying to define that at an appropriate level. Thinking really hard about foreseeable harm and how do you actually predict it. And a lot of the measures that I think we often use and see are more lag measures. So I think that's going to be an important area to think about, and also to think about how you connect your different insights and data sets. So, for example, how do you use your complaints data to think about your outcomes testing and connecting those things. I've spoken about scope already, so I'm not going to kind of immediately say any more about that. And we might get some questions which we'll be happy to address, I think, in the Q&A. But really just to kind of emphasise before getting stuck into some questions from Eric, I mean, I think this really is about cultural shift. So it is the sort of topic that does require a fairly forensic look at the rules themselves, the guidance and set of activity to make sure that you are meeting those things. But I do think it's really important not to miss this point about culture at the heart. And so really thinking about who in your business is the voice of this topic. Is it the chief risk officer, or is it people leading business areas, or even your CEO? And I think that's really worth you thinking very carefully about, because how you do that sets a tone for how your organisations will respond. And so you don't want this to be tick box. You do want it to be embedded. I think the final thing I'd say is, though, that this is a continuation, I think, of a journey that the industry has collectively been on for some time now. So so thinking about vulnerable customers. So I think truly embedding and meeting the requirements that the FCA has already set out in relation to vulnerable customers will get you a long way towards compliance with the duty in a number of areas. And I think businesses will have different challenges depending on where they start from in relation to that. But yeah, I'll pause there. I think that's enough of a whistle-stop tour, I think, to some of the key areas of the duty. And perhaps Eric might get into some Q&A.
Thanks, Caroline. That's a really helpful oversight. I'm not going to let you off the hook for just a moment, though, because I think it's really important we get into this cultural point. For me, it feels like the jumping off, and if that doesn't work, then the rest of it gets ever harder. And by that, what I mean is, culturally, the aspiration from the FCA is to see good outcomes, very much the demand focus or demand side focus through the DNA of the business. If I was to be sort of sat in a first or second line in a business, how would I understand the culture shift that this culture shift that the consumer duty requires?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first things to say is that you sort of need to understand what your culture is today. And so partly my answer depends on where you start from. And I see kind of two opposite ends of the spectrum in a way of risk, which is at one end of the spectrum, there's a risk of complacency, I think, for the firms that say, no, we're good with customers. We've already got customers at the heart, which is great. And if that is true, then obviously that's a big advantage. But I'd sort of, in that context, I'd warn against complacency and thinking you've already got it covered, because the FCA is really clear that this is a step up. This is not TCF by another name. This is a lot more than that. So I think you have to start with, what is our culture today? And then I think you have to define what you want that culture to be. And, I do think actually in lots of ways, it's almost forgetting all of the detail for a moment of the fabulous rules, guidance, all the rest of it, and just saying, actually, if we genuinely put our customers at the heart of our businesses and think, broadly, what do they want and need, and we design things to meet that, then again, I think a lot of the duty would sort of take care of itself if that were genuinely the thing that was the core driver. So yeah, I think it start with what is the culture and then set what you want it to be. And then there are a number of ways in which you get there, and that doesn't happen overnight either. So you have to be pretty determined, I think, to make sure you drive that culture right from the top and throughout the business.
Thanks. That's just really helpful, and I appreciate that for commentators and for representatives such as myself. There can be a degree of sanctimony in what we're conveying to you. We don't underestimate the size of the challenge. But if I was to just give a very brief case study, if we think of a vanilla product like a personal loan, it's on a fixed rate over a fixed term with a fixed repayment, etc. The early repayment requirements stipulated in legislation, one would think that that's actually something which very quickly, if you look today, customer journey and a gap analysis fulfilled the dimensions of the consumer duty, not least because of CONC, etc. However, you could quite quickly come to a question which says, if we're trying to avoid foreseeable harm, should we be thinking about some form of repayment holiday? Should you be able to pay a 24-month loan over 26 months, say? And that, I think, is really, I just throw that out, and I'm not using that as a concrete example that one might immediately run away and think about within individual organisations. But I think it illustrates a train of thought that Caroline's looking to portray, that actually we do need to be fundamentally reviewing how certain products might be adapted to fit the ambitions of the consumer duty. And that's challenging. So I guess, obviously, having highlighted some of those challenges, and I think equally, as you did in your contextual pitch just a moment ago, Caroline, you called out some of those challenges, perhaps less so with your former FOS hat on, but much more as PA consulting. You'll have had a lot of conversations. I think it'd be really helpful for the audience just sort of to perhaps step through some of those challenges in a little more detail. So what are the challenges I'm likely to face as I look to operationalise?
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. And I think to your comment of a moment ago, I think it's important to underline that I think, I absolutely recognise that the sort of scale of the challenge. And I do think it's also, as well as saying, important to have a forensic approach and make sure that you really have thought through what you're doing. I'd also say don't boil the ocean. You do need to be proportionate in this as well. So actually making sure that in setting your approach, you've done that, I think is really important. I mentioned capability already, but I think that's a really important area, thinking about the capability you have both to implement the duty, and then in terms of ongoing monitoring, I think is a particular area. And again, it will depend on your start point. And many of the sorts of areas that will require enhancement are probably things that have been developing over time. But there'll be some gaps, I think, particularly in relation to, as I mentioned earlier, understanding behavioural bias is one that comes up quite often. I think that people have some capability. It's a bit varied. I think one of the areas that comes up most often in the conversations we're having, of which there are many, is kind of defining outcomes and how do you monitor them and how do you measure those outcomes. And again, I think an important point to emphasise there is it's about making sure there's a coherent set of information that builds all the way up to your board lens. And so it's important for the board to be able to have the right level of detail, to be able to have that oversight. And crucially, I think thinking about how your different metrics fit together. And I think, the FCA has been clear that it doesn't expect firms to go and start collecting additional degrees of information, for example, about protected characteristics for these purposes. But where you know those things, it kind of won't be okay to know something and not act. And I think that's one point I'd really emphasise, is the importance of not just having that information, but also having means by which you can draw out the insights. I also think in that context, it's going to be important to keep an eye on how the topic is developing. That will include, of course, casework from my excellent former colleagues at the Ombudsman Service. So I do really think that's going to be important, is keeping a close eye on the emerging kind of body of casework in this topic. So we can no doubt return to that. I think scope, making sure you're clear on scope, I think will be important. So I mentioned the SME boundary already, but again, sort of thinking through how you do that, making sure you're compliant. But I think there's also sort of attitudinally, if you're on the margins, you've got a choice about how you treat that. And I'd probably encourage people not to err on the side of just about. I think if you're not sure, you'll be better off giving the spirit of the duty at the margins, I would suggest. And then again, I think the last one just comes back to mindset and culture, and being really clear about that, and putting that in the heart. So it doesn't count just to have a swim lane that says comms or training. Really thinking about what culture do we have, what culture do we expect to have in the future, and I think making the consumer duty part of that. And it actually can be part of the opportunity, to me, is I think, for a lot of businesses I talk to, this is where they want to go as businesses. They want to put their customers in the heart of their thinking and recognise that is the future. And actually, this can be a really positive lever for change. So I'd really encourage businesses to kind of seize the opportunity, as well as the undoubted challenge that comes with such a significant change in regulation. Take the opportunity to use it for the change that you've been trying to drive anyway.
Thanks, Carol. That's really helpful. I just want to come back to the point on protected characteristics, because I noticed that it's come through in the questions, which do please keep coming. There's a flood that have come in already. We won't be able to get to them all, but I'll try to draw some themes from them. And I guess there's a broader point here in the challenges that you face to the proportionality, not boiling the ocean observations. There will be issues such as power of attorney, such as bereavement, that you need to think about, perhaps around or in the context of sludge practices. You might not get to them straight away, but certainly they need to be on the roadmap. And then I think another theme in terms of the challenges coming around coming out of the questions is something around the perimeter. So what is in and what is out of scope. Mm-hmm. And I would just encourage some thought, and I would very much look to I would expect organisations to look to that first principle, forgive the pun, of the philosophy that this is about good outcomes for all consumers. And why would you necessarily want to delineate some consumers relative to others if your purpose is to deliver good outcomes for all of your customers? and that might include those that you aren't in a position to help. So do also in that edge case box think about those customers who might be declined for products and services as well. Caroline, I'd like to, if I may, move us a little bit towards some of the milestones, and I think one of the questions that seems to be zooming into focus rather quickly is the issue of advising boards by the end of October, and that's my shorthand for the requirements that came in the policy statement. One of the things that you think should be considered by the board in October relevant to or relative to sign off?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to start with the kind of the high level, I mean, I think boards will need to be satisfied that there is a robust implementation plan and that they can get the assurance they need. So I mean, I'd encourage boards to think about it from their own perspective first. How do you assure yourselves that management has a robust plan in place and that it's realistic and achievable? And I think that there has to be, though, and it is a recognition, I think, from the FCA that those plans will not necessarily deliver absolute best-in-class brilliance in every respect by implementation date, but there's sort of a degree of maturity that has to be reached to be compliant, and that's pretty non-negotiable. The rules will be enforced from that date, and so it will be expected that firms are meeting those rules. So I think that's really important. I mean, I think one of the things that the FCA I think are likely to want assurance around is the proper resourcing of the programme. And making sure that has been properly resourced and thought through. I mean, I think, for many firms I speak with, it's kind of, there are still some unknowns in the plan. So, still some stones to look under, so many firms, I think, are sort of developing various tools to help them with these assessments. But until you actually apply them, there's an element of, you don't know what you don't know. I mean, I think I'd say, first of all, from a non-exec perspective, it's making sure that within the plan, there aren't areas that have big areas of unknowns that could cause significant problems with implementation. But I think it's about setting yourself a realistic roadmap and not letting yourself off the hook and thinking, that'll have to do. I think you've got to push quite hard on making sure that minimum compliance at the very least is achieved. And then I think looking at how, as an ongoing programme, you will move toward best practice is kind of the spirit, I think, for a lot of firms.
Thank you, Caroline. Sorry, the satellite delay there was my clumsy attempt to find the unmute button. Very helpful. One of the observations in the chat has been around whether there needs to be a notified NED and who that might be on the board. I should declare an interest. I'm the Vice Chair and the Chair of a Risk Committee on a small building society. And from when I sit, as you can imagine, I'm talking to our CRO about what we might present via the Risk Committee to our board. I'm very happy to share a little insight from what we're looking to do. First, I think it's about remembering what boards do, right? So, we are the stewards of business and the guardians of the purpose that business sets out to deliver on, the strategy to achieve its purpose, and obviously the monitoring that sits around that and approvals for various different aspects of corporate life that make all that happen, such as policies, procedures, etc. So that is ostensibly in a microcosm, and there's obviously far more eloquent wording that you'll find on the internet and elsewhere to describe, but that's sort of what boards do. So clearly in what you're presenting to your boards, it needs to be with one eye to the non-executive responsibilities. And certainly, we would expect that a non-executive has a degree of oversight. And that's a non-executive oversight. So should that individual happen to be the Vice Chair and the Chair of the Risk Committee, said individual is not interested in getting involved in the working groups and the project groups, etc., wants to be able to report to their board that the plan is on track. Plans and projects seldom go I guess, in a sort of green glide path to their conclusion. So equally, I'd want a no surprise agenda. So at the outset, I'm looking for the project plan that gives me the milestones, the plan on a page, the Gantt chart, have your own vernacular for these things, and the progress updates that you intend to bring via your management and executive committees to the board. So that's the sort of structure that we're thinking about. Again, back to PA consulting, interested if there's any builds on that from your side, especially, I suppose, from clients that might have taken a slightly different approach.
Well, I'm very happy to give you live advice, Eric, on your approach. But no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think I think making sure that the board maintains its sense of independence and doesn't, I mean, just as a general principle of good governance. And I think, I mean, one of the challenges of this sort of topic is there's an awful lot to cover, but I think making sure that the board MI, the board information and assurance is at the right level. I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's unlikely the FCA will prescribe which board member it should be, but I think a lot of firms I'm speaking with are, board risk chair is. So I think you're probably on the hook for that one, Eric. I would suspect, given your day job as well. So yeah, I think that's quite a common approach, and obviously sits quite neatly with the sort of normal duties of a board risk committee. But yeah, I think it is really important that the board demonstrate their involvement in this topic and their overall involvement in it and in conduct generally. I do think, though, that, as you say, it's kind of ultimately these things have to be led by management. And I think, as I mentioned at the outset, I do think the whose voice you put some of the communication around this topic in, I think will set a tone for the organisation about what sort of thing is this. And I think, I think we've had some questions about, is it, if you do all of the things in the duty, does that not equal the right culture? And I think it probably does. It's just not quite where you want to start from necessarily. So don't see it as ticking all the boxes. See it as a fundamental shift. And I think that has to be led from the CEO, from the top of the organisation, but fundamentally also requires the buy-in of middle managers and people on the front line talking to customers every day, because that's where this stuff really is. Rubber hits the road. Is what is your culture? Well, it's the experience that people who interact with you have every day. And I used to run a public-facing business, and you're only ever as good as the last kind of conversation you had with one of your customers and how well you treated them.
Thanks, Caroline. Just a couple of thoughts to build on that. A general insurer shared some of the watch-outs that they're considering as they're pulling together their board papers may or may not be relevant, and clearly there might be direct or perhaps more likely indirect parallels, but certainly customer understanding, right? So, if one thinks of the provenance of a lot of complaints, I said it's some trepidation because, Caroline, you're far more versed in these things than I, but usually it's based around did the consumer understand? Did I tell the consumer enough so they could understand what they were buying? And actually, having told them what they were likely to be buying, did I actually deliver on that promise? Right? So did whatever it was I do, make or sell, do or make or sell what was intended? So the first thing I think is, have you really got that consumer understanding now? The second actually is, in your service level agreement design for those products and services, have you made it as easy across the entirety of the journey at each touch point? And by that what I mean, and I think there's a lot of discussion in some of the consultation around this, is it as easy, for example, to enter and or exit a product? Is that as easy across different channels, because this is an omni-channel proposition, etc. And certainly I think there needs to be something in those plans that gives the board assurance that your full product and service suite will be scrutinised and reviewed, and within that the overlay of vulnerability, and we might wince a little at vulnerability, and I think the FCA had previously considered something of 24 million people in the UK in that situation. In the teeth of a recession, that number might be higher, and vulnerability for your portfolio, depending on your target market, which is all about understanding your customer, of course, could be much higher, and it could actually be a central proposition in the face of a recession. So there's some really fundamental thinking around vulnerability, I think, needs to be given. And then the final point that we discussed was enhancement MIs, so the progressions. You baseline, you're proportionate, you've prioritised. How do you then continue to embed culturally such that that standard of excellence, which might be the introduction of good outcomes in the principle, continually builds? Because excellence obviously always grows, and what was excellent today might not be considered quite that higher bar next time round. So having talked a little about the board, and I think we'll probably want to just touch on a few questions if time allows towards the end of the discussion. There are one or two other things that I'm keen just to get your thoughts on before we perhaps go through some of those attended questions that have been tabled. And I think a key one in that is, how do I report and evidence the successful implementation and, of course, the ongoing monitoring of the duty? So I'll give you an insight from a general insurer. Caroline, be very interested in some other thoughts.
Yeah, I think those are really helpful insights, actually. I think that one of the things probably to think about in terms of your evidencing of implementation is kind of programs you've run before, particularly regulatory change ones, particularly the ones, well, both the ones that went well and perhaps also might gently suggest the ones that you think didn't go so well, and learning the lessons from that. So, there has been an awful lot of regulatory change in recent years. And so, I think taking the lessons from those implementations, I think is one of the things that I would call out. I think, outcomes monitoring is a particularly key area. And I think, as we've touched on in the discussion generally, I think making sure that you've got sort of qualitative and quantitative information. I think making sure as well that you're able, and I think your outcomes testing gives you one of the key insights here, to if you like, have an objective view about harm. So, whether the customer liked it or not is not in and of itself going to give you the answer to whether or not something met the objective tests in the duty. So it will be still a very important metric, of course. So your net promoter and all those other really important kind of ways in which you measure customer satisfaction in different areas of the business. So they're still really important metrics, but they won't tell you objectively whether or not somebody got a good outcome. And so I do think that designing your outcomes testing is going to be a really important area. And I would say, make really good use of your complaints information, both kind of your own complaints information, but also looking at wider trends that you can see from the Ombudsman. And I mentioned earlier, kind of any emerging casework that the Ombudsman no doubt will be grappling with these issues over the coming kind of weeks, months, years. And so making sure you understand how that is evolving, because to your point, Eric, I think, this will evolve over time. I think there's absolutely no doubt about that. And, understanding and keeping your finger on the pulse of that evolution, I think, is going to be really, really important for firms. And that's not to say, before I sort of alarm everybody, that this is a forever moving target, but this is simply to say that this will take some time to bed in, I think, and for everybody to kind of grapple with exactly what does it mean and where does good practice sit. And taking the opportunity to try and be market leading in that, though, for your customers is what I would advocate for. But still keeping a sort of horizon scan will be part of your overall picture and understanding what you need to do to sort of continue to stay current.
Thanks, Caroline. In the chat, there seem to be quite a few supplementaries on a number of the areas that we've picked up on. So I'll try to draw out some answers, I think, on some of those. I think you have a colleague with you waiting in the wings, Mark Maxwell, and please, Mark, if you have thoughts or observations, feel free to come in, because I think it's kind of the chorus of voices here that help us all to understand. I'm going to come back to the issues around vulnerability, protected characteristics, etc., and certainly, this I guess consternation that, on the one hand, protected characteristics under GDPR need to be very sensitively handled, absolutely right. On the other hand, of course, there are degrees of expectation, and to a certain extent, Caroline, I think you've answered that. The first point I would just remind us all of is, I think it's sort of up front and centre at the start of the policy statement, that, where the law obliges you to do something, the law comes first. So we do have some guide rails or guardrails around the application of the consumer duty. And I appreciate that for those in second and perhaps also in the third lines, those certainties are quite often the benchmarks at which you test the first line. So we need to be very clear on that. Thereafter, there are, I guess, sensitivities that need to be carefully thought through. And interestingly, I think in another of the questions, the issue around behavioural biases surfaces, where reference is made to research that was undertaken as long as a decade ago. I guess the point really that sits behind that around knowing your customer, as opposed to consumer due diligence and knowing your customer and customer research, is something that for some firms might be quite novel, for others it'll be well versed. Caroline, in terms of that customer research, etc., have you got any thoughts or tips that could help people?
I think, again, I think remembering that there is a need to be proportionate, I think, is an important point. I think I absolutely would endorse your point that, the law remains the law. And indeed, when the Ombudsman's thinking about what is fair in all the circumstances, there's a whole bundle of things to take into account, but law, and actually the common law, is something I think sometimes has been overlooked in some of the sort of previous issues that I dealt with at the Ombudsman. So I think it's important to emphasise that. I think the FCA has said in terms that it doesn't expect firms to start collecting kind of protected characteristic data where it doesn't already, but that if you have it and you do identify, and if there are correlations between harms and particular groups, then that might very well trigger an existing obligation, actually, but may very well also do so in the context of consumer duty. I think for me, this is a topic where our collective knowledge continues to grow. And I think there will be an important role to play of sort of customer research more broadly at that sort of slightly more macro level. So that's not at the individual level, but at understanding the patterns and understanding where particular groups of customers, and particularly those that are vulnerable. I think that's going to be an important part of this, that knowing that a particular group who are vulnerable are potentially going to suffer harm and not acting will be a problem in a way that it might not have been until someone complained, or unless and until there was a kind of specific rule breach that someone could point to. And I think I wouldn't think that these are going to be, for the most part, I suspect these are going to be topics that have been, if you like, known issues. I mean, I often say to people, go and ask your compliance team what stuff has always troubled them about the things that you do, like, where's your little worry list of, I've always wondered if this is really okay, and we've sort of decided it's sort of okay. Well, that might not be enough anymore. How you correct that, of course, doesn't necessarily lead to extreme answers of we stop doing that entirely. And I think most definitely the FCA, again, is clear that it doesn't want to see a reduction in service to customers in terms of available products. So let's not sort of, I think really being cautious about that and not having unintended consequences is really important. But I think taking a fresh look at the worry list, I think will be really worth doing.
Thanks, Carol. I'd like to bring him up because Mark, you did a lot of work for the conduct regulator throughout the pandemic, and a lot of that obviously was designed to support customers who might otherwise have found themselves in particularly vulnerable financial circumstances. I just wonder, have you got any builds or additional dimensions to what Caroline's already said?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is Caroline's point about, minimizing access is going to be a problem if that's the strategy you take, because I think it might not be explicit in the GT, but the FCA's got much more of a focus on access to products and services. I think on what you need to collect in terms of research and information, the FCA said you need to collect enough information to avoid causing foreseeable harm. I think what that means for you as a firm depends on the types of harms that you identify that your customers might experience. And then I think you need to segment them properly so you understand what the different groups are across your business. And then you can start to think about what are the right metrics that you need to monitor the outcomes for the customers that you've got, and the worry list you have of harms.
Thanks, Mark. That's really helpful. I'm going to pick up some of these questions that perhaps we've discussed in their broader terms, but not perhaps now specifically. So forgive me if this feels like a bit of a scattergun approach, and I guess it's a sort of fingers on the button round for Caroline and Mark. I might also abuse my chair's privilege by throwing in some thoughts if I feel that there's something that I can add. Perhaps one of the first questions, and thanks for your patience for the audience, was how firms are dealing with the logistics of products which are in, out of scope, and in particular unregulated products. This can be challenging where there are a set of customers who are in their product life cycle fall into each category. Now, we touched on this by saying at the highest level, philosophically, consumer duty, good outcomes really for most responsible businesses would be a catch-all. I just wondered, perhaps Mark, you haven't had the opportunity to add your thoughts on that. Was there anything else you'd want to say in that particular area? Obviously, we need to respect the fact that there are clear delineations on certain product sets, such as small businesses within the rules, perhaps a little bit more challenging for asset managers, but nonetheless, Mark, did you have any thoughts?
I think with small business customers, I think this goes back to understanding what your customer segments are, and there are types of commercial customers that do behave more like retail customers, and that is sometimes quite obvious. And there are some aspects of regulation that I've been involved in that have been designed with that way in mind. I'm thinking particularly about sort of general insurance disclosures where you have very small businesses like a plumber with a van who, to all intents and purposes, is a retail customer. So I think thinking about things like that will help. So I think that's probably what I'd add on classification.
Thanks, Mark. And hopefully that goes some way to at least provide an analytical framework if you're considering trade products. Another point raised is that some larger firms might be considering ahead of in the context of the consumer duty. Right now, I know that most of those under fixed supervisory have at least an accountable executive and are standing up pretty material projects to help them to deliver. I'm sure that PA Consulting has been steeped in some of the discussion. The proportionality point comes through a little here. Caroline, I wonder, if you were to pick up the phone, what I guess would be the conversation you might have with a major financial institution, and then perhaps what you might have with a smaller or specialist organisation.
Yeah, so, and I think, and one of the questions was asking, should there be a sort of head of customer outcomes, or even, should there be a head of consumer duty? I mean, I think even for the larger institution, I think I'd be a bit hesitant about labelling it as such, as opposed to making it part of your overall thinking in relation to, how you deliver great customer outcomes. So, I mean, I think the thing to resist is making it a sort of siloed activity, and just another thing for your people to try and remember as well, alongside, you know, all of the other things. So I mean, one of the things I think I'm really in favour of actually is bringing together the thinking around consumer duty, vulnerable customers, and some of the issues we touched on in terms of the cost of living and what that'll mean for customers, and thinking about those really connected topics together. And driving that from the heart of the business as well. I mean, clearly kind of risk teams and compliance teams have got a massive role to play here in helping to sort of steward this change through. But I really do think it'll be important to have those things sort of in the heart of the business. In my experience of, you know, in leading a business, I think, you know, change comes from within the business itself when it's really effective, not from the sidelines. Instructions. It needs to be kind of in the core, not an add-on activity. I mean, I think, you know, obviously for the much smaller firms, I don't think anyone would expect them to have an individual team or even person who would sort of, you know, for example, be the head of outcomes. I mean, I think that wouldn't be realistic. And I think it is thinking about what's appropriate. I mean, the advantage I always used to see in the sort of the IFA market, for example, that much more kind of close personal conversation that IFAs would often tell me was at the heart of the business actually is, you know, kind of really advantageous in this context. So doing the right things for your customers is in the heart of it, whatever your scale. But I don't think it necessarily means, you know, inventing new roles necessarily. I mean, I'm not ruling that out as one of the means by which you do it. But I do think if you do, the other thing people quite often do is have a champion. You know, like you have it's quite often a mechanism people use, isn't it? And I think that's kind of okay, but you've got to be sure that the business will sustain it and that it will live those concepts and changes, not just do it because somebody, you know, with that hat on is encouraging it. So I think it's really about trying to embed this in the heart of the business, and your everyday strategy, not as a sort of thing on the side of the desk.
And just to build on that point, of course, that might mean whatever approach you take might mean either a direct cost or an opportunity cost. You know, you'll be concluding budget cycles around about now. Let's make sure that there's a coordinated discussion across the board as you agree budget. This is a mandatory change that might need to be factored in. Back to the board, just a quick point around the 31st of October, maybe the gap analysis hasn't been completed. You'll all know your boards, or at least your executive directors will know your boards better than Caroline, Mark, or I would be able to second guess. But certainly I think it's about making sure that you have articulated, as we discussed earlier, where you are at that cycle, in that stage of planning in the cycle, and the milestones and the staging or gating that gets you to 31st July 23 and 24, and obviously for third-party relationships, April of next year. So I'm not so sure that the work has to have been done. Certainly I think that the plan that demonstrates how it will be done is important. And let's not forget, the FCA didn't consult on this date. Okay, so I think, you know, they would be sympathetic actually if you found that that achieving that date was challenging, provided they knew, of course, that you had ways of delivering that extended perhaps a little beyond October. Ensuring that culture is embedded at senior management level. I'm going to sort of pass on that question in the interest of time, because I think we've probably talked around the cultural approach to take on that. Equally, I think that Mark has built out a little bit more colour around SMEs, which I'm taking to be small and medium-sized enterprises as opposed to subject matter experts versus standard customers. And, you know, that conceptual approach, which is that across your business you would be looking to deliver those good outcomes. And then I think we've touched on the answer to the suite of consumer duty rules resulting in the right culture. Caroline, I think you gave a good steer, which is yes, but perhaps top down is very much valid in that space. We've done quite a bit on accessibility, so I think the question I'd like to just spend a couple of moments on is we're having to be proactive on unforeseeable harm. Do you think that using protection to support clients against foreseeable harm will cover this. That's quite interesting because you're sort of moving into general insurance, and I guess that depends a little on circumstances. But Caroline or Mark, did you have any other thoughts on that?
Mark, why don't you go? I don't think I've got anything probably to add, but Mark, what do you think? Anything you'd want to add to that?
I wasn't sure what the question was asking, Eric. Was it preventing foreseeable harm through what exactly?
Well, I think protection as in, unfortunately from the question it's not explicit, but I would expect that that is around some form of insurance, general insurance.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't want to, anyhow, from there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it might be a good strategy, it might not be. I think we've seen where insurance add-ons can go wrong in the past. So I think it does depend to, going back to what are the outcomes and foreseeable harms that you have on your radar, and how are you going to mitigate them. So, a protection product might be right in certain circumstances, but you just need to think about it, and you need to think about it for different customers, different segments of customers and different products. And that's kind of what's at the heart of the GT rather than blanket approaches.
Thanks, Mark. And as we come towards the allotted hour, I think there's one point that I would just like to draw out. The conversation has to an extent been somewhat theoretical and has been a little altruistic. Ultimately, businesses do need to deliver a return, be that for their investors or their members, or I guess if nothing else, for the sustainability of the business itself. The balance, I guess, is the question. And I don't know, Caroline, Mark, who'd prefer to field that, but there is this tension between delivering that good outcome relative to being able to sustain a degree of profitability in the business. I just wondered if you had any broad thoughts on that point.
Yeah, I'm happy to pick that point up. I mean, I think my own view, and this will sound even more kind of altruistic probably, but sustainably good business is going to involve good customer outcomes, or that's not sustainable business. And I think, in my old job, I spent quite a lot of time obviously dealing with the issues that built up in the system, some of the systemic issues in the system. And I think ultimately it will not just be good for customers. This executed right, this will be about the ambitions that good businesses already have about putting customers in the heart of what they do. So this shouldn't be, a foreign set of thinking to people. It should be about, really grasping the opportunity to move forward with that agenda, and hopefully not seeing it as being in competition with the bottom line, because actually the bottom line, ultimately, any of us are as good as what our customers think of us and whether they want to do business with us.
Caroline, thank you. That's, I think, a very sensible point, which I should thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you as well for all of your questions. I hope you found the responses to those questions informative. On the 19th of September, we're running a workshop preparing for Consumer Duty, where we focus on the practical actions you can undertake to prepare your organisation and the board for the incoming Consumer Duty. So more on some of those subjects that we've discussed this afternoon. You can find more information on the UK Finance website or contact our training team with any questions, and we do very much hope that you'll find that second seminar will be helpful to you as well. But for now, thank you all. Do please fill out those feedback pro formas if you get a moment, and goodbye from Caroline, Mark and myself. Thank you all very much.